This video is about a YouTuber known as Beau of the Fifth Column, real name Justin Eric King. I will be showing with clear evidence that Justin King was an important member of a human trafficking ring and that he and his associates had at least 100 victims according to court records. King has never publicly admitted to or accounted for what he did. Instead, he's done the exact opposite. He spun the story to frame himself as a hero who broke the law in the process of helping vulnerable and desperate people. I usually don't make videos like this on my main channel. However, I addressed what Beau did about a year ago on my second channel with extensive evidence, and it got next to no attention, so he was able to just ignore it. So I've decided to make a more organized video addressing King's past on my main channel in the hopes that it will reach more people and that he might have to actually address it directly and honestly for the first time ever. Every claim made in this video will be backed up by a source, usually a direct reference to publicly available court documents from Beau's trial. Citations will be numbered, with the respective source linked under that number in the video description and the pinned comment. To begin, I'll let Justin King recount his own version of the story by playing a clip from an interview that he did on a libertarian podcast called Lions of Liberty, back in 2016. At the time, he had not yet created the Beau persona and was still going by his real name and running his own news website called The Fifth Column. Here is his version of how he ended up getting arrested and serving time in prison.
Well, I was a military contractor for about 8 years. I did mostly non-governmental work. And at one point, we angered the federal government and I got my door kicked in. And I kind of realized at that point that I might have better uses for my skills. And that brought me to journalism because I could shoot a gun and I could shoot a camera. So I started with Digital Journal, which is a small Canadian outlet. I moved to the Anti-Media and then the Fifth Column.
Wow, let's just take a step back for a second. So can you tell us a little bit more about, I don't know how much you can detail, maybe legally, but what went on there with that whole incident there with getting your door kicked in? Was that because of something the company you were working for had done? Or, was that something that you were under investigation for? Can you detail that a little bit more?
Well, basically, I worked for a company that did refugee recovery. We got refugees out of bad countries, whether it be Eastern Europe, Central Asia, wherever. We started working in Uzbekistan, and this much is my personal theory. Uzbekistan was a U.S. ally at the time. They were also really, really, really evil to Jewish people. We were getting them out, and we were visited by State Department, and they told us to stop. And I don't know if you've ever met any military contractors, but when you say something like that to them, especially when they've already been paid, you're likely to get, the middle finger, which is what happened. And they showed us. A few weeks later, we all had our doors kicked in and all got arrested. If I understand correctly, I do believe a synagogue hired us to get the people out of Uzbekistan.
So, Justin King's own version of events is that he was employed by what was probably a synagogue to help Jewish refugees escape Uzbekistan to the USA. In the process of doing this, he broke US migration law, so he eventually ended up getting arrested and serving time in prison. In his recounting of the story, Beau is something of a martyr who broke the law and went to jail for a good cause, to help vulnerable, desperate, persecuted Jewish people get to safety. I'm going to show that all of this was a blatant lie. Beau disgustingly inverted the reality where he very directly, knowingly and intentionally deceived and exploited at least 100 other human beings for his own benefit, and instead framed himself as a hero who saved the vulnerable. We could talk about the immediately obvious holes in this story, like the fact that there's no record of this supposed massive anti-Semitism problem in Uzbekistan that caused a wave of Jewish refugees to flee there in the mid-2000s, the time period where Beau committed his crimes. Nor would it really make much sense for such refugees to have decided to illegally migrate to the USA rather than claim asylum upon arriving, or claim asylum in a closer Western European country, or go to Israel, where they could have gotten immediate citizenship. Such refugees, if they had ever actually existed, would have had at least a few dozen better options than illegally migrating to a country on the complete opposite side of the world. The story simply makes no sense on the face of it. It's like something that someone would make up after watching Borat and mishearing Kazakhstan as Uzbekistan. But there's not really any need to go around poking holes in his story like this, because there is plenty of evidence that shows what he really did. Many of the court records from Beau's trial are publicly available, as are some academic and government reports that examine his case. And this evidence makes it very clear that he was definitely not helping refugees. Rather, he was a manager in a Florida company called Eurohouse, which was, in reality, a front for a human trafficking and forced labor ring. The fact that Beau worked at Eurohouse is taken from his own resume at the time, which was entered onto the record as evidence during his trial and is thus directly cited in official court documents. In this resume, he stated that from 2004 to 2007, he worked for Eurohouse Holding Corporation. A description of the real activities that Eurohouse engaged in is provided by a post-trial summary from the Florida State University Center of the Advancement of Human Rights. I cite them at length. Eurohouse Holding Corporation brought Eastern European workers to the Florida Panhandle for short-term work on temporary J1 or H2B visas. The vast majority of the workers were female between the ages of 19 and 23. Moreover, most were also students who were intent, upon returning after several months to their home in Eastern Europe to continue their studies. Many had been promised non-existent jobs when they were recruited in their home countries. Upon their arrival in the Florida Panhandle, they were instead employed for substandard wages by Eurohouse and assigned to work in local hotels and resorts. Eurohouse operated as a labor subcontractor, providing services to hotels such as the Sandestin Hilton. Eurohouse was able to offer the low bid on labor contracts precisely because they did not pay federal minimum wages to their employees. They further charged the students between $1,500 and $2,500 each for visa processing, job placement, and transportation fees. In addition, the young workers were charged to stay 15 or 20 persons per condominium throughout a variety of locations throughout the Panhandle. Enforcement was carried out by verbal abuse, threats of violence, and threats of fines, or non-payment of wages. Almost all the young workers had a plane ticket allowing them to return to their home countries, but they would have incurred substantial costs were they to try and fly home at an earlier date. The labor trafficking conspiracy overall proved lucrative and seemingly insulated from law enforcement oversight. Because the victims were exploited on a temporary basis, they most often simply chose to return home at the end of the summer without reporting the exploitation or participating in an investigation. This pattern finally changed in 2003 with the exploitation of a group of foreign nationals, predominantly from Bulgaria and Romania. With their assistance, the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office discovered a further criminal conspiracy that involved even more extensive visa fraud and alien smuggling on the part of Eurohouse officials. The ensuing investigation also revealed that US citizen Justin King was employed as the front man for Eurohouse, negotiating new contracts with hotel owners and communicating with state and federal agencies to further the conspiracy. As part of his role in the criminal operation, King submitted over 1,000 fraudulent visa applications. King and his co-conspirators were found to have brought in over 200 foreign nationals to work as hotel housekeepers through the use of these illegally obtained visas. Evidence presented at trial showed that King and his co-conspirators had used forged hotel letterheads to further their scam. Most of the foreign national workers brought in through the fraudulent visa scheme were eventually contracted out to hotels and resorts, other than those who had supposedly sponsored them for their visa. Finally, it was revealed that when the federal government had become suspicious and stopped issuing visas to Eurohouse, King and the other defendants had continued their fraudulent activity under the guise of a new labor contracting company called Woland. That doesn't really sound like rescuing Jewish refugees from Uzbekistan, does it? Sounds more like human trafficking. But we might want to give Beau the benefit of the doubt here. Perhaps he was just a low-level employee in this operation and took the fall for the worst of it when he really, truly didn't know the full extent of what was actually going on and had no hand in any of it. Maybe he was disconnected from the rest of it and was just helping out with the visa fraud part and genuinely believed that all that he was doing was bending the rules a bit to help people come and work normal jobs in the USA. Maybe he wasn't aware that, once they arrived, they were being used by the company that he worked for as cheap, coerced labor. Well, they actually tried to make this argument during his trial, and it didn't go very well. His lawyer argued that he was just a glorified gopher for the human trafficking operation, meaning little more than an assistant, one who was presumably unaware of its full extent. Yet this was contradicted by the aforementioned resume. King described his role at Eurohouse as being quite high level and involving lots of important responsibilities. He said that he was currently directing daily operations of a multinational labor firm, responsible for the overseas recruitment of temporary workers, ensuring their arrival to the work locations, arranging housing and transportation, and coordinating with foreign governments, acting as company liaison to US government, responsible for multi-million-dollar budget. I don't think a glorified gopher would be directing operations or responsible for a multi-million-dollar budget. King's importance to the operation is further confirmed by himself again in a sworn statement, cited in the indictment against him, which he made to the US State Department on February 17, 2006. In it, he stated that at the time, he had been the general manager of Eurohouse for 1 year, and he also confirmed his direct involvement with the victims, stating that, "I also manage the Foreign Service employees in day-to-day operations. I ensure our customers are satisfied with the service we provide." Further evidence of King's very direct involvement in the exploitation of at least 100 victims is provided by the transcript of a testimony of one of the victims who testified at his trial. This young woman from Bulgaria described how the scam operated. She was given an H-2B temporary worker visa, which she was made to pay a substantial amount of money for. Under the conditions of the visa, she was supposed to work at one specific hotel, the Bay Point Marriott. Yet upon arriving, Eurohouse took her to work at a different hotel, the Sheraton 4 Point. She testified that Justin King had been her first point of contact and that he had personally informed her of this change. The deception here is twofold. First, the victim had chosen to come to the US based on the belief that there was a stable job ready for her at one hotel, but upon arrival, she was immediately contracted out to different hotels, based on the needs of Eurohouse. Second, this made her unknowingly complicit in immigration fraud, as she was only permitted to work at the Bay Point Marriott. Yet King and his co-conspirators immediately had her working at other locations. The victim ended up being shopped around by Justin King personally to a number of different hotels, violating her visa conditions each time that she worked somewhere else. This was a core part of how this operation functioned. Young women from Bulgaria and Romania were enticed to come work in the USA as hotel housekeepers at specific locations on temporary visas. Yet upon arriving, they found that they were instead rented out as cheap labor to whichever hotel offered Eurohouse the best deal, allowing them to win as the low bidders on hotel housekeeping contracts. Her testimony additionally reveals that when the time came where she needed a visa renewal to continue working, Justin King personally arranged it for her and brought the documents to her to sign. These documents said that she would be working at yet another hotel that she was not actually working at, yet King never mentioned this fact to her, meaning that he made her even more complicit in immigration fraud. He charged her $1,154 for this visa renewal and garnished her wages to pay for it. This is highly irregular to say the least, as according to the US Department of Labor, the employer is legally obliged to either pay for the workers' H-2B visa fees or at least reimburse them in their first work week. $1,154 also appears to have been a massive overcharge, as the cost for this renewal today is $205. Given that she was making $8 an hour at the time, $1,154 would have represented about 144 hours of work for her. So Beau of the fifth column not only participated in both the visa fraud and the labor exploitation side of this human trafficking operation, but he also personally scammed the victims out of what little they had earned from it. And that's not even the only way that he scammed the victims. He also personally split their paychecks in two to avoid having to pay them overtime, issuing them a second paycheck under the name of a shell company. The witness said, "They were giving two separate checks. We were new in the country and I didn't know, and they told me that's the way it have to be, and I was thinking that was normal." In one pay period, the witness worked 78.7 hours, yet was only paid $210 due to wage garnishing and the theft of her overtime pay. When the witness was asked who gave her these paychecks, she answered that it was Justin King or the secretary for Eurohouse. An important thing about this witness testimony, by the way, is that every time the witness was asked about something, she was also shown a piece of evidence that had been admitted to the court. Things like contracts, paychecks, and receipts. So she is not merely claiming this happened. They had clear evidence demonstrating that it did. The witness also said that she was made to pay rent for the housing provided to her by Eurohouse. This is something that is expanded upon and corroborated in a report on labor exploitation from the US Government Accountability Office, which used the Justin King case as an example of cases where H-2B visa holders were the victims of fraud and abuse. This report states that Eurohouse charged up to 16 workers rent to live together in a 2-bedroom house. Additionally, it states that the company coerced workers to sign contracts agreeing to lower pay than originally promised, and that the company paid as little as $48 for 2 weeks of work because of excessive paycheck reductions, including fees for not cleaning housing accommodations and arriving late for transportation to work sites. Damningly, the report notes that the court referred to the treatment of the victims by King and his co-conspirators as legal slavery. Beau is additionally referred to here as one of 4 executive officers. If Beau's role as an important part of this operation on its own wasn't already bad enough, court records show that he was additionally skimming a bit off the top for himself. During the execution of a search warrant, a contractor agreement was discovered. The document stipulated that a company called LGM Inc. would share trafficked labor with Eurohouse and pay them $1 per hour that the victims worked. LGM Inc. does not appear to have been a real company. Rather, it was a fake company that was registered directly to Justin King and incorporated at his home address at the time, which he appears to have been using to skim money off the top of the human trafficking operation without his co-conspirators knowing. This is clear both from the fact that it was his company and his company alone, and that he and a friend, Stephen Murphy, were the only ones who signed agreements relating to LGM Inc., none of the other co-conspirators. Court documents indicate that Stephen Murphy was not a co-conspirator in this case. Rather, he was Justin King's friend and he was uninvolved. King often fraudulently used his signature and personal details. So the document was, in reality, signed by King alone, who had forged Murphy's signature alongside his own. King's co-conspirators claim to not have been aware of this service agreement, indicating that King was likely the sole beneficiary of it. And given that he was the only one out of all of them who had signed it, and that it was an agreement involving King's own personal company, the evidence points strongly to the fact that that was indeed the case. Nonetheless, even on the off chance that they were just lying and they were actually all in on it as well, the money would most likely have been split 4 ways between them, meaning King would still personally have made 25 cents per hour worked by the victims, so he was incentivized to make them work as much as possible. The evidence also indicates that he organized even more benefits for himself from this human trafficking scheme. The government said that they would present witnesses during his trial who would state that Justin King himself was directly paid $2,000 in exchange for providing one hotel with traffic labor. This was an agreement directly between the hotel and King's personal company, LGM. Unfortunately, the subsequent testimony of these hotel workers does not appear to be publicly available, but it's very unlikely that the prosecution claimed to have had such witnesses in the indictment and then didn't actually call upon them in court. So it's safe to assume that these testimonies did take place and that they're simply not public record. This is all of the evidence that's available that I've personally been able to find, and it already paints a really bad picture for Beau. There may very well be more out there that I simply do not have access to though. The US Government Accountability Office report which I cited, for example, was clearly written by people who had access to more court documents than I've been able to find, as they cited additional facts from the case that do not seem to be publicly available. The system used in the US to allow public access to court documents, PACER, is very weird and difficult to navigate without lots of experience. You also have to pay to use it. Someone who has more experience with it, like a local lawyer or journalist, may be able to find further evidence of King's acts somewhere in there. Nonetheless, what we've gone over is already more than enough to conclude that Justin King, aka Beau of the Fifth Column, was an important and knowing conspirator in a human trafficking operation. He profited from his direct participation in the deception and exploitation of vulnerable young women from poor countries, enticing them to come to the USA under false promises of stable, legal work. He forged their documents and made them complicit in immigration fraud. He was directly involved in organizing the contracts with the hotels in which they worked. He also organized additional contracts specifically to benefit himself, which gave him even more profit from exploiting them. He had direct contact with the victims victims, telling them when and where they would be working and paying them directly. He personally scammed them out of the overtime pay that they were legally entitled to. He personally scammed them with exorbitant fees that were garnished from their wages, all as part of an operation that the court described as legal slavery. The available evidence makes it clear that he, as the self-described general manager of this human trafficking operation, was deeply involved in its management, was directly involved in deceiving and exploiting its victims, and directly profited from his actions. He was far from some low-level fall guy. Quite a bit different from his version of the events that painted him as saving Jewish refugees from Uzbekistan. From here, things aren't quite as clear and out in the open as what we've gone over so far. Beau was actually not convicted of human trafficking or forced labor. Bizarrely, the prosecutor did not even charge him or any of his co-conspirators with those crimes, even though the evidence that we've gone over indicates that they really could have been convicted of them. Beau was convicted only of the lesser charges of visa fraud and alien smuggling. This is what has enabled him to lie and be coy about the details of what he actually did. This is kind of weird in a case that was so bad that the court described it as legal slavery. It's especially weird because the US attorney for the Northern District of Florida later noted that Beau and his associates' actions had in fact included all of the elements that would have established forced labor under Florida law. In particular, the use of labor obtained through false promises, through threats of serious harm, or through abuse of law or of legal process, such as threats of deportation. So why didn't they charge them with those crimes then? It's clear, even from just the evidence that we've gone over, that Beau and his co-conspirators committed worse crimes than just visa fraud and alien smuggling. It's baffling that they didn't face any charges that specifically dealt with the actual exploitation, deception, and coercion of their victims. Absolutely none of that stuff is encompassed in visa fraud and alien smuggling charges. King also received a relatively light sentence. The maximum was 10 years, yet he only got 3 years and 5 months with 3 years probation. He was also only ordered to pay $700 total, despite the fact that each count he was convicted on carried a maximum fine of $250,000. And he was also not made to pay any restitution to his many victims. The government also initially sought forfeiture from him and his 3 co-conspirators of $3.2 million, yet ended up only seizing $1 million from them. And on top of this, very curiously, months after he had already been sentenced and was in prison, the government decided to return a property that it had seized from Justin King and his family back to him. Justin lived at this property, though public tax records show that it was owned by someone else who shares his surname, most likely his mother. Her own registered address was at a different, much larger property, so the property that was returned seems to have been a second house owned by his family, where Justin lived. This was the property where King had registered LGM Enterprises, so it was likely seized due to the fact that it was directly used as a part of the criminal conspiracy. I've been unable to find any explanation for why it was returned. There appears to be no public record of King and his lawyers contesting the seizure. It's like the government just decided to be generous months after they had already landed their convictions and put him into prison. They could have kept this house, there would have been nothing stopping them from doing so. It was used to further pretty serious criminal activity after all, yet they just gave it back. Usually, the government needs to justify an act like this. Unfortunately though, in this case, the statement of reasons is sealed, meaning made not accessible to the public. It's very curious that the state decided to seal such a crucial document that could have explained their generosity. King was additionally released early, after only serving 31 months of his 41-month sentence, and his supervised release also ended early. King has also talked openly about the fact that he served at least part of his sentence in what he frames as a sort of luxury prison that he highly recommends.
But the last couple of years I spent at Montgomery Federal Prison Camp, which if you have to go to prison, I highly recommend it. Tennis courts, I had a dog, there's no fence. It's when people say Club Fed, that's the place they mean. It was a joke. And most of the people there were the ultra wealthy. Gave me a good view of the disparity in the justice system.
This is all super weird. He went from being an integral part of a human trafficking operation, to getting seemingly heavily undercharged, to being given a bunch of breaks by the government, to getting released early, and then immediately doing a complete 180 from his previous life, and becoming a self-styled radical activist/journalist. Something is very much off about that trajectory, and it warrants a fair amount of suspicion, but I don't want to deviate too much from the main point here with speculation, because the main point, which the evidence proves, is that Beau of the fifth column is a human trafficker. While he may technically not have been charged and convicted of the crime, his actions, as demonstrated by the evidence, nonetheless very clearly constitute it by any reasonable definition. For example, the UN Trafficking in Persons Protocol defines human trafficking as the recruitment, transport, transfer, harboring, or receipt of a person by such means as threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, or deception for the purpose of exploitation. This clearly applies to his case, as it involved the recruitment, harboring, and receipt of people who were coerced, defrauded, and deceived for the purpose of exploitation. The court also described the operation as legal slavery, and it has been used as a textbook example of human trafficking and forced labor in numerous different instances, such as academic reports on the topic, US government reports on the topic, and anti-human trafficking guidebooks. His case has been referenced as a typical example of human trafficking in newspapers, and has been used as a textbook example of a human trafficking case in law schools. So he more than deserves the label of human trafficker, conviction or not. Now, I know there's going to be responses to this to the tune of, well, it was a long time ago, or he served his time, what's the problem? And the problem is that Beau has not only never even admitted to what he did, but has also done everything possible to hide as much of it as possible from his audience. In fact, as demonstrated in the clip that I showed earlier, he's outright lied about what he did to paint himself as some sort of hero who went to jail for saving Jewish refugees, rather than for manipulating, deceiving, coercing, and exploiting young women from poor countries for his own monetary benefits. On the few occasions on his channel where Beau has reluctantly been pushed to breach the topic, he's kept things very vague and does not go into any specifics whatsoever. The closest he's ever gotten to admitting what he did was in one video from 2021, where he admitted that he was convicted for alien smuggling but did not elaborate further.
10 years ago, 12, 13, but a long time ago, I got busted for alien smuggling. I know, shock, right?
While this is technically true, I think we can all agree that what Beau did was a lot more than just alien smuggling, and that not expanding upon that to include the whole "I was a leader of a human trafficking and labor exploitation ring" part is being intentionally vague, because alien smuggling could be a lot of different things, some of which could be considered very noble, and others which could be considered very much not noble. What if your alien smuggling conviction was, for example, for smuggling vulnerable Jewish refugees out of danger, as Beau claimed? Then that would be pretty noble and commendable, despite the criminal conviction. But his alien smuggling convictions aren't for doing that, are they? So for him to leave things so unclear is very intentionally manipulative. It allows his sympathetic audience to fill in the blanks themselves, and the way that they fill in those blanks is predictably going to be very, very generous to him. For example, this fan of his on Reddit seems to think that Beau just smuggled refugees. And this one seems to believe he just helped immigrants cross the border. And this one argues that Beau merely helped a bunch of immigrants get jobs. Clearly, his ambiguity regarding the actual facts and the extent of what he did is allowing some of his fans to fill in the blanks and frame it in ways that actually make him sound very good, which is pretty concerning given that in reality, he did human trafficking and caused direct and serious harm to actual human beings for his own benefit. If what we were talking about here was just Beau helping some refugees illegally cross the border, this video wouldn't exist because I don't care about that. For that matter, even with the severity of what Beau actually did, if he'd been open about it all from the beginning, this video wouldn't exist either. I personally believe that even a human trafficker could be given the chance to turn a new leaf after they acknowledge what they did, apologize for it, and restitute their victims. But Beau hasn't done any of that. He hasn't even taken the first step by coming clean about what he actually did. Instead, he's either been incredibly vague about it and allowed his fans to fill in the blanks in ways that are very favorable to him.
I got busted for alien smuggling. I know, shock, right?
Or outright inverted reality by claiming that his convictions for deceiving and exploiting people were actually for helping people.
Got refugees out of bad countries, whether it be Eastern Europe, Central Asia, wherever.
You can't argue that he's a guy who did something bad and has since been rehabilitated when he doesn't even admit to the bad things that he did. He even produces videos for a pro-union YouTube channel, as a guy who engaged in one of the worst forms of labor exploitation that he's not even owned up to. It's ridiculous. I've also seen some people try to excuse the fact that he has lied and avoided admitting to what he did because he's doing good now by making the videos on his channel. And that's just not the case either. He's a political YouTuber who makes low effort, off the cuff, very simple to make and produce videos that he makes huge money from and that have made him quite famous. He's easily a millionaire off doing this, possibly multiple times over, with a Patreon with thousands of people donating to him every month, and even his own merch store. Now, I obviously don't think that it's bad to make money off YouTube, given that I do that too. I'm just saying here that it's already weird the way that a not insignificant portion of viewers sometimes frame political content creators as if the subject matter of their work somehow changes it from, well, being their work, and makes them like selfless martyrs who are actually doing everyone else a charity or a service by making videos just spouting their political opinions or whatever. And that's already very dumb. It's cult-like, celebrity worshipping behavior, and it's even dumber when this sort of notion is used as a justification, as reasoning for why we should all just ignore and forget about Beau's never addressed and actively lied about human trafficking past. He's not some selfless guy doing charity. He's a business owner who does this to make money, and it's really incredibly easy work that he profits massively disproportionately from. All he has to do is turn on his phone camera for 10 minutes every day and blurt out whatever comes to mind to make at least tens of thousands of dollars every month. Just because he says things that you agree with while making tons of money from doing so doesn't mean that he's magically absolved from having to come clean about his past, and it certainly isn't a replacement for actually making good with his many victims. It really seems that for a lot of people, as long as you advocate to vote for the same election candidate that they like, they'll just make excuses for you no matter what. If it was a YouTuber who they didn't like or who didn't agree with them, I could not imagine them being so willing to just brush aside, unaddressed, and outright lied about human trafficking. And for that matter, if he can't be trusted to not lie about or hide the fact that he did human trafficking, then how exactly can you even trust what he says in his videos? His videos are all, without exception, a guy ranting in a shed in a fake southern accent off the top of his head, who never presents any evidence for what he's saying. They're entirely based on the viewer having to just trust him, yet he's clearly not at all trustworthy. I don't really expect much from Beau here. The fact that he hasn't addressed this in anything resembling an adequate fashion after such a long time, when the publicly available evidence against him is so overwhelming, indicates that he is very deliberately hoping that most people simply don't figure out the full extent of what he did. The time to come clean with everything was when he was getting started. The fact that he didn't do so, and instead outright lied to paint it as having been some heroic thing, is incredibly suspect. Finally coming clean now, many years later, only after a video like this has been released, would be a sorry I got caught, rather than a genuine sorry. Beau did something absolutely horrible to at least 100 people for his own personal gain, and has since become filthy rich of his YouTube channel while actively lying about and obfuscating the facts about what he did, because he knows that many people would not think very highly of him if they knew the truth, especially given the fact that he likes to present himself as left-wing. He has, to public knowledge, never apologized to or restituted his victims, despite being a millionaire YouTuber who very much has the means to do so 100 times over. Up until now, only relatively small channels have covered this. Most creators who've breached the issue have actually been on his side, if you can believe that. Like many other YouTubers, they built their platform via networking with other bigger creators, rather than through just creating good content that stands up on its own. So they prefer to stay on the good side of Beau's large fan base, rather than be honest about and denounce the horrible things that he did and that he has never even owned up to, let alone done anything about. Perhaps they will at least now have the humility to come out and admit that they were wrong, or at least the self-preservation instinct. If Beau does finally directly address the full extent of what he did, make sure to pay attention to whether he directly addresses the evidence or not, because it is damning, and it can't simply be hand-waved away by empty words, excuses, or a persuasive argument. Rather than acknowledging what he actually did, he may attempt to skirt around and ignore the proof against him, and try to emotionally manipulate his audience again by concocting yet another version of the story that paints him in a less bad light. Often in situations like this, the accused or their defenders strategically decide to hone in on one specific point that they consider the most favorable to them, whether it be, say, a minor error or discrepancy, or just a minor side point. And then they use that as a way to sort of avoid the main point, which in this case is, that the guy did human trafficking. So watch out for that as well, both from Beau and the inevitable thousands upon thousands of fans who will defend him, as always happens in situations like this. He has to directly answer what the evidence shows, and anything that he claims that contradicts it must be backed up with evidence of its own. He has to specifically answer to specific questions, like, why did you lie about having smuggled Jewish refugees when you really trafficked poor and vulnerable Eastern European women and then exploited them directly yourself? Why have you been so intentionally vague about this on the few occasions that you brought it up? How about you just come clean? But he's probably not going to answer any of these questions, because the only real answer to them would be to present real concrete counter evidence that contradicts all of the evidence that I've gone over here, or just to come clean and admit to it all. So I think that he'll most likely just ignore it and hope that it all blows over. And he's probably right to, because that's usually what happens in these cases. If there's any need for me to address this further, it will be done on my second channel, because this is not the sort of content that I'd like to have on my main channel, but unfortunately putting this there is pretty much the only way that it's going to get any views at all. After this, I'll be going straight back into working on the usual sort of videos that you get on this channel, so don't worry, this is a one-time thing. And yeah, that's all. Bye.